The aliens watched us and laughed. For centuries, they hovered above Earth, hidden behind the cold expanse of space, observing humanity with amusement. To them, we were weak, fragile, and foolish creatures, stumbling through history with wars, greed, and emotions that made no logical sense. They called us the cosmic joke, a species that had somehow survived despite lacking the intelligence, strength, or discipline of the great civilizations that ruled the stars. When they finally revealed themselves, it wasn't with weapons or hostility. They didn't need force. Instead, they arrived with arrogance, believing humanity would bow the moment they set foot on our planet. Their technology was beyond anything we had ever seen. Cities trembled as their ships darkened the sky, their strange metallic forms stretching from horizon to horizon. They didn't come as conquerors, they came as owners, as if Earth was already theirs, and we were just primitive creatures waiting to be tamed. At first, we were powerless. Governments collapsed overnight, leaders surrendered without a fight, and the world was plunged into an era of submission. The aliens, calling themselves the Zithri, established their rule without resistance. Their advanced weapons disabled anything we could have used to fight back. Our attempts at rebellion were laughable to them. We were like ants trying to bite giants. The Zithri forced us into labor, treating us as little more than disposable workers, mining Earth's resources for their endless expansion. To them, we were nothing more than tools, slow, inefficient, and easily replaced. They even found amusement in our suffering, mocking our emotions, our pain, our desperate will to survive. A species ruled by feelings instead of logic, they sneered. They will break soon. But they underestimated us. They didn't understand what made humans different. They didn't see what was coming. We weren't the strongest species. We weren't the smartest. But we had something the Zithri had lost long ago, something they couldn't comprehend. We had resilience. We had adaptability. And most importantly, we had patience. For years, we played our part. We worked under their watchful eyes, obeying their commands, letting them believe they had broken us. They saw our compliance as weakness. They thought we had accepted our fate. They didn't realize we were waiting, learning, studying them as they once studied us. And then one day, everything changed. It wasn't an act of war. It wasn't a grand rebellion with explosions and battles in the streets. No, our revenge was something far more terrifying. The Zithri had always prided themselves on their control, their logic, their superiority. But their biggest weakness was their own arrogance. They never considered that humans could turn their own minds against them. One by one, the Zithri began to change. Their minds became unstable. Their once perfect logic became clouded. They started feeling things. Fear, doubt, anger, despair. Emotions they had purged from their own species long ago. They didn't understand what was happening to them. They thought they were infected. In a way, they were. But it wasn't a disease. It was humanity itself. We had learned their technology. We had studied their weaknesses. And we had discovered something they had never anticipated: how to manipulate their very thoughts. It started small. Whispers in their dreams. Hallucinations in the corners of their vision. A creeping sensation of unease that grew with each passing day. The more they ruled over us, the more they absorbed what made us human. And as their cold, logical minds crumbled under the weight of emotions they could not control, the balance of power shifted. One by one, they fell. Their leaders became erratic, paranoid, unable to trust their own kind. Their soldiers hesitated, questioning orders for the first time in their existence. They broke apart from within, and before they realized what was happening, they were no longer our masters. They were our slaves. Now the galaxy watches in horror. The once mighty Zithri, feared across the stars, have become shadows of their former selves, trapped in the same chains they forged for us. And humanity? We're just getting started. But the real question is, what will we do with our new power? The Zithri never expected to lose. Even as their empire crumbled, they refused to believe it was happening. They had ruled for thousands of years, shaping lesser civilizations, bending them to their will. No species had ever turned against them successfully. To them, control was a certainty, not a question. But Earth changed that. At first, they thought it was an anomaly, an isolated failure caused by unforeseen variables. They convinced themselves it was temporary, that they could regain control if they simply crushed the resistance harder. But the more they tried, the worse it became. Their own people began to turn on each other. The whispers in their minds never stopped. Every night, they dreamed of things they couldn't explain. Memories they never lived, emotions they never felt. A Zithri general, once cold and calculating, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by regret. Regret for actions he had never questioned before. A scientist, who once saw humans as nothing more than a biological inconvenience, began to hesitate before giving an order that would hurt them. These feelings were foreign, unbearable, but impossible to ignore. Some of them broke completely. Their bodies were strong, their minds disciplined, but emotions were something they had purged from their species long ago. They had evolved past them, or so they believed. But now, those same emotions were creeping back, stronger than ever, and they didn't know how to fight them. For humans, it was a slow, quiet victory. The moment the first Zithri hesitated, the power had already begun to shift. And when they lost their ability to command without doubt, everything they built started to collapse. It wasn't just Earth anymore. The infection, if it could even be called that, spread further than we expected. Other planets under Zithri rule began to change. The enslaved races who had once suffered under their rule started to notice the cracks in their masters. Their commands grew weaker, their presence less feared. The same emotions that broke them on Earth spread like wildfire, and soon, even their own kind began to question their rule. But not all of them broke the same way. Some fought back, desperate to reclaim control before it was too late. They gathered what little remained of their discipline, suppressing their new feelings with force. Those who resisted the change turned to violence, attempting to erase every trace of what they had absorbed from humanity. They failed. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't undo what had already taken root inside them. It was deeper than just thought. It was in their very existence now. And the harder they tried to suppress it, the faster they unraveled. The war never truly ended. It simply transformed into something else. The battlefield was no longer fought with weapons, but with something more terrifying. The Zithri were no longer in control of their own minds. And humanity, we were the ones pulling the strings now. The question was, what would we do with that power? Some believed we should destroy them completely, eradicate the Zithri before they could ever rise again. Others wanted them to suffer, to live under the same chains they had placed on us. There were even those who thought we should help them, guide them through what they were becoming. But no one could agree on a path forward. And that uncertainty created something new. Fear. The Zithri were not just breaking, they were evolving, changing in ways no one could predict. Some of them, the ones who fully embraced their emotions, became something entirely different. No longer the cold, logical rulers they once were, but creatures filled with the same unpredictable passion that defined humanity. They weren't just suffering anymore. They were learning. And that terrified us more than anything. Because if the Zithri truly became like us, what would stop them from surpassing us? What if, instead of being broken, they were simply becoming something stronger? For the first time, humanity wasn't sure if we had won at all. The air on Earth had changed. It was no longer filled with fear, no longer thick with the weight of submission. But it wasn't peace either. It was something in between, something fragile. The Zithri still existed, though they were no longer our masters. Some of them wandered our cities, lost, hollow, trying to understand the emotions they could no longer escape. Others remained in the ruins of their own command centers, staring at screens that no longer displayed orders, listening for voices that had long since fallen silent. The most dangerous ones, however, were those who refused to accept their downfall. They gathered in the shadows, broken but not beaten, whispering to one another about reclaiming their power. They saw their newfound emotions as a disease, something to be purged. And they blamed us for infecting them. On the surface, humanity controlled Earth again, but deep down, we knew the fight wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The war we thought we had won was evolving, turning into something more complicated, something we didn't fully understand. We had taken their power, but in doing so we had created something new. A species that had once been unshakable was now unpredictable. And unpredictability was dangerous. Some humans saw an opportunity in the chaos. Scientists, philosophers, leaders, each had their own ideas about what to do next. The governments that had survived the invasion argued endlessly about what path to take. Some believed we should completely eliminate the Zithri before they could ever rise again. Others thought we could use them, bend them to our will the way they had done to us. A few, though, believed something even stranger. Some believed the Zithri could be allies. It wasn't as crazy as it sounded. There were Zithri who had fully embraced their new reality, who had stopped fighting what they had become. These were the ones who didn't resist the emotions, the ones who let themselves feel everything without fear. And while many of them were still lost in confusion, Some of them were starting to change in ways no one expected. There was one in particular. His Zithri name was impossible for humans to pronounce, so he took a human one, Daniel. No one knew why he chose it, but it was the first sign that he was different. Unlike the others, he didn't wander aimlessly or hide in the shadows. He observed. He asked questions. He spoke to humans not as a conqueror, not as an enemy, but as something else. Something in between. Daniel wasn't the only one. Across the planet, other Zithri were beginning to adopt human traits, names, habits, even beliefs. Some of them started dreaming in ways they never had before. Others found themselves drawn to things they once ignored, art, music, stories. They weren't just breaking apart. They were becoming something new. But not all of them saw this as a gift. The ones who resisted, the ones who refused to change, were becoming more desperate. They hid in the ruins of their fallen cities, gathering in the cold silence of the places they had once ruled. They still had technology, still had knowledge that surpassed anything humans could imagine. But now, for the first time, they also had something else, rage. True, burning human rage. And rage needed a target. The first attack wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a grand display of power. It was a single act, quiet and devastating. A human settlement on the outskirts of what had once been a major Zithri stronghold was found in ruins one morning. Not from bombs, not from weapons, but from something far worse. Every human inside had disappeared without a trace. No bodies. No struggle. Just gone. The message was clear. They were learning from us. The question was, would they learn our mercy or our cruelty? The humans who had once argued about what to do with the Zithri now found themselves divided even further. Some wanted to strike first, to wipe out the remnants of the species before they could regain their strength. Others still held on to the hope that a new kind of peace was possible. But there was a third group now, one that was growing larger by the day. There were humans who had begun to see the Zithri as more than enemies, more than victims. They saw them as something else entirely. Something worth saving. Or worse, something worth following. Not all humans wanted to fight the Zithri. Some wanted to become them. Lines were being drawn. The world was slipping further into uncertainty. The war wasn't over. It had only changed shape. And deep in the remains of their once great empire, the last true Zithri warlords were preparing for the moment when they would remind us of what they had been before we had broken them. The question wasn't whether the war would begin again. The question was, when it did, who would be fighting on which side? The night sky above Earth was no longer empty. The stars that once shined undisturbed were now overshadowed by ships. Some human, some Zithri, and some something else. They hovered in silence, waiting. Neither side moved, but the air itself felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. On the surface, humanity had never been more divided. Some still clung to the old ways, seeing the Zithri as nothing more than an enemy that needed to be destroyed before they could rise again. Others believed peace was possible, that the Zithri were no longer the cold conquerors they had once been. And then there were those who had crossed the line completely. Humans who no longer saw themselves as human, who believed the Zithri's evolution was something to embrace. The disappearances hadn't stopped. Every week, more settlements vanished without a trace. At first, it was only humans, but then reports started coming in of Zithri, those who had accepted their new emotions, going missing as well. The ones who had fully embraced their transformation were being hunted, taken in the dead of night, and no one knew by whom. Daniel had seen it happen. He had watched as one of his own, a Zithri who had learned to laugh, was dragged into the darkness by something faster than the eye could follow. He didn't scream. He didn't struggle. He simply looked back at Daniel and whispered one final word before disappearing. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The ones responsible didn't leave messages, didn't make demands. They only left silence in their wake. But soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The warlords, the last remnants of the old Zithri, hadn't been hiding. They had been preparing. They weren't just resisting their transformation anymore. They were fighting back in a way no one had expected. The Zithri who had embraced humanity were no longer just traitors in their eyes. They were proof of weakness, proof that their species had been tainted. And the warlords would rather burn their own kind to ash than allow that weakness to spread. When the first transmission came through, the entire planet listened. A Zithri leader, one of the last who had remained untouched by the change, appeared on every screen across the world. His voice was steady, cold, untouched by the emotions that had shattered the others. The experiment is over. That was all he said before the signal cut. But it was enough. Within hours, the attacks began. The warlords struck first, targeting the cities where humans and the changed Zithri had begun to coexist. There was no warning, no chance to negotiate. They saw both sides as the same now, an infection that needed to be wiped out. They didn't use their old weapons. They didn't need them. They had found something else. A way to turn back time. The first victims were found frozen in place, their bodies unresponsive, their minds blank. They were alive, but their eyes were empty, stripped of everything that made them who they were. It was as if the emotions had been erased from their very existence, like the Zithri warlords had found a way to rewrite reality itself. It didn't take long to realize the truth. They had found a way to remove what made us human. One by one, those who had embraced change, humans and Zithri alike, were being erased, their minds reverted to something cold and hollow. The warlords weren't just fighting to reclaim their empire. They were trying to undo everything that had happened, to wipe away every trace of weakness, to return themselves to what they had once been. And the worst part? It was working. People began to vanish in the middle of conversations. A human mother who had once protected a Zithri child now stood in the streets, staring blankly ahead, her memories gone. A Zithri who had once cried over the beauty of music now sat motionless, expressionless, as if he had never felt anything at all. The world was unraveling. Daniel knew there was only one chance left. The warlords weren't unstoppable. They were powerful, but they were afraid. Afraid of what they were becoming. Afraid of losing control. That was their weakness. But could it be exploited before everything was lost? The answer had to come soon. Because the next target wasn't a city. It wasn't a settlement. It was Earth itself. The sky was the first thing to change. It darkened, but not like nightfall. This was something unnatural, a shadow stretching across the atmosphere, swallowing the stars, silencing the world beneath it. At first, people thought it was another attack, another tactic from the warlords. But then the messages started coming in, whispers over broken signals, voices cutting in and out, speaking in tones too shaken to comprehend. It wasn't the warlords. It was something else. Daniel stood among the scattered survivors, his gaze locked on the sky. He had seen the destruction, the erasure of identities, the slow and silent unmaking of everything they had fought to build. He had expected the warlords to push further, to strike Earth at its core, to wipe out the final remnants of what they considered weakness. But this was different. The warlords had stopped. Not by choice. All communication from their fleets had gone silent. Their ships, once a looming presence in orbit, now floated lifeless, drifting without command. The same beings who had vowed to erase humanity, to strip away all traces of emotion, were now trapped in eerie stillness. And then a new transmission cut through the silence. It wasn't human. It wasn't Zithri. It wasn't anything they recognized. A voice, distant and layered, spoke in a language that sent shivers through every mind that heard it. Not because it was foreign, but because it was too familiar. It wasn't just words. It was thought, memory, feeling. You have changed what was never meant to change. The message carried no anger, no threat. Just cold certainty. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. For the first time, he realized, this war had never just been about humans and Zithri. They had been playing with something bigger, something they didn't understand. The warlords had tried to erase emotion, to purge what they saw as weakness. But emotions weren't just an accident of evolution. They were something deeper, something connected to the fabric of existence itself. And now something was watching. Something older. Something that had been waiting. The warlords had tried to return to what they once were, to cleanse themselves of humanity's influence. But in doing so, they had drawn the attention of something that had been content to let them rule. Until now. The shadow in the sky deepened. One by one, the warlord-controlled ships began to twist, their forms stretching and warping as if being rewritten. The soldiers who had once fought without mercy, the leaders who had called themselves gods, they were no longer there. The ships still floated, but what remained inside them was no longer Zithri. And then, the warlord's final transmission came through. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was screaming. Daniel turned to the humans beside him, to the Zithri who had chosen change over destruction. He saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that, for all their victories and losses, they had never truly been in control. The warlords were gone. And now, something else had taken their place. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The warlords were no more. Their ships remained, But whatever had taken them was beyond human or Zithri understanding. The screaming from their final transmission had long since faded, but its echo remained, lingering in the silence like a ghost. No one moved. No one spoke. The sky, once filled with chaos and conflict, was now heavier with something far worse, an unknown presence watching, waiting. Daniel could feel it pressing against his mind, something vast and endless, something that had been there long before humanity had ever existed. The voice that had spoken before returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just heard. It was felt. You do not understand what you have done. The words weren't a threat. They weren't even angry. They were simply disappointed. The darkness in the sky shifted. The stars, once hidden, began to reappear, but they weren't where they had been before. The constellations had changed, the very fabric of the universe twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Time itself felt wrong, like something was unraveling, coming apart at the seams. Daniel realized too late what had happened. The warlords had been trying to erase emotion, to return themselves to what they had been before they were tainted by humanity. But in doing so, they had disrupted something fundamental. Emotions weren't just biological impulses. They were something deeper, something woven into existence itself. By trying to erase them, the warlords had broken something. And now, whatever had been keeping balance, whatever had been holding the universe together, was reacting. The humans and the Zithri who had embraced their change weren't the ones in danger anymore. The entire universe was. Then, without warning, the ships that had once belonged to the warlords began to move again. But they weren't attacking. They weren't fleeing. They were merging, their metallic forms twisting together, reforming into something else. A structure, massive beyond comprehension, took shape above the planet. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a weapon. It was a doorway. A deep hum resonated through the air, not a sound but a feeling, vibrating through every cell in Daniel's body. He looked to the others, to the humans and Zithri standing frozen in awe and terror. Whatever was coming next was beyond them. It was beyond war, beyond survival. Then a single figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't Zithri. It wasn't human. It wasn't even entirely physical. It shimmered in and out of existence, a shape that couldn't fully be perceived. It stepped forward slowly, as if adjusting to a reality it hadn't walked in for a very long time. Daniel didn't need to hear the words to understand. They weren't meant to feel. Not the Zithri. Not the humans. Not anyone. Emotion wasn't an accident of evolution. It wasn't a mistake. It was a lock. A barrier. A way to keep something from waking up. And now that barrier was broken. The figure turned its head slightly, as if considering what to do next. And then, for the first time, something unexpected happened. It smiled. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. That single expression was more terrifying than anything he had ever seen. It wasn't a look of malice or cruelty. It was curiosity. The kind of curiosity a predator had when it encountered something it hadn't hunted in a very, very long time. The war was over. But the real nightmare had only just begun. Daniel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than any battle, any loss, any fear he had ever known. The figure before him, shimmering between existence and something else, had smiled. Not in cruelty, not in triumph, but in curiosity. That was what terrified him most. The warlords had thought themselves gods, reshaping their kind, erasing emotions to restore their former power. But they had been playing with something far beyond their understanding. In trying to rewrite themselves, they had broken a seal, a lock that had been in place since before either species had existed. And now, whatever had been trapped beyond it was awake. The sky remained twisted, stars flickering like dying embers. The massive structure above them, the doorway that had formed from the warlords' ships, pulsed with an eerie glow. Something was waiting beyond it, something that had not touched this world in eons. The figure stepped forward, not walking but shifting, as if it was still learning how to exist in this form. Its eyes, or what passed for them, settled on Daniel. There was no hostility, no threat. Just interest. As if it was studying him, trying to understand what had changed, what had made this world so different from the one it had once known. "You are not as they were," it said, its voice layered, reverberating through the air and inside Daniel's mind at the same time. "You feel." Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay still. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We do." The figure tilted its head, considering this. Then, without warning, the structure in the sky shifted again. The glow intensified, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw something beyond it, an expanse of darkness, endless and vast, filled with forms too immense to comprehend. The doorway was not just an entrance. It was a passageway to something deeper, something older than stars. The being raised a hand, and the hum in the air grew louder. The ground beneath them trembled. Then it stopped. The being hesitated, as if uncertain. Its form flickered, unstable, like it was caught between two choices. "You were never meant to change," it murmured. "And yet you did." The glow of the structure dimmed. The darkness beyond it receded. For the first time, something unexpected passed over the figure's face. Uncertainty. Daniel took a slow step forward. "What happens now?" he asked. The being remained silent for what felt like forever. Then finally it spoke. "The choice is no longer mine." The air shifted, and in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. The doorway above them trembled, then collapsed inward, folding into itself until nothing remained but empty sky. The stars returned to their proper places. The silence that followed was heavier than any battle. The war was over. But what had been awakened still lingered. The remaining Zithari stood among the humans, watching, waiting. They had fought for survival, for the right to feel, to exist beyond what they were. And now, the universe itself had acknowledged that change. But at what cost? Daniel turned to the others, exhaustion weighing on him. "We rebuild," he said, though the words felt too simple for what had just happened. "We move forward." The Zithari who had embraced emotion looked at one another, at the humans who had stood beside them. The ones who had feared them, hated them, fought against them, now stood as allies. And for the first time, there was no division. No war. No masters or slaves. Just something new. The stars above held their secrets, and whatever had awakened was still out there, watching. But for now, Earth was safe. For now, they had won. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.